In today's video, we are diving deep into the 2025 Dynasty rookie class. If you're in Devy, if you're in Dynasty, if you just like looking into the future, then this is the video for you. I'll be giving you my top 24 rankings and tiers, and we'll be talking about the strengths, weaknesses, and just overall look at this class. I have charted the prospects that I would consider on my radar, and we'll look at that chart as well as we go throughout these names. All right, the first player we're going to talk about is the only player in tier 1 for me. They stand there alone at this time. Again, these are just my opinions, but that is the wide receiver out of Missouri, Luther Burden III. Mizou. This guy is an absolute dog. Former 5-star recruit. He was the number 2 wide receiver in the 2022 high school recruiting class. And when I charted all the players that were on my radar, if you will, he had one of the best charts by far. He had the third best PFF receiving grade out of 233 wide receivers who had at least 50 targets last year. So throughout the entire nation, he had the third best PFF receiving grade. Only, I believe, Malik Neighbors and Malik Washington, if I'm not mistaken, had a better PFF receiving grade than him last year. He put up huge numbers, 86 catches, over 1,200 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. He was an efficient player. He caught 71.7% of his passes, and he has a high yards per route run number. He was top 7 in yards per route run last year. The other names in the top 7 include Troy Franklin, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors. He's also very good after the catch. He had an 8.4 yak per reception number. That is higher than Malik Neighbors coming out this year, Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, Marvin, Amika Egbuka, all the names that you know and we talk about every day in this class. Outside of Malachi Corley, Luther Burden had a higher yak per reception than those names. He's a reliable deep ball threat or contested catcher, if you will, 56.5%. Now, his play style is pretty interesting because he's not like this typical dominant outside wide receiver. He actually played 81.7% in the slot. And if I was to try and bring you a comparison in the NFL, and a lot of that is useless right now, let's just be on the same page. But at the moment, his play style reminds me a lot of 2 players combined, CeeDee Lamb and Deebo Samuel. If you were to combine those 2 names, those 2 play styles together, that's what I see a lot in a name like Luther Burden. And I think his physicality almost reminds me of Jamar Chase as well. I believe Mizou is going to try and play him a little bit more on the outside this year. Kind of similar role to what we saw Malik Neighbors this year. That's what I'm projecting, where it's very much all over the field. You are playing 50% in the slot, 50% out wide, and kind of moving all around the field. But in my opinion, he's the belle of the ball in this class. If you have him in Devy, you should be absolutely thrilled because he is a lock to be a top 15 pick in the NFL draft, in my personal opinion. And he's the only player in tier 1. All right, let's get into tier 2. All right, quite a few players in this tier. The first player for me, my second ranked player, another wide receiver, is Tet McMillan, the kid out of Arizona. And I call him a kid, but he is a monster. He's 6'5", 210 pounds, and he also charted really, really well. Again, the charts that you're going to see today, I am charting these guys based off of each other, based off the class, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Leave a comment. I'll try and reply if you need any explanation, but put up some huge numbers, 90 catches, which was 9th in the nation, almost 1,400 yards, 4th in the nation, and 10 touchdowns while putting up the 11th best PFF receiving grade. He had a good yards per route run at 2.79, extremely reliable hands from Tet McMillan, 2.2% drop rate. That is the best of anyone in this class outside of actually Travis Hunter that we're going to talk about here. He was also a featured player. I mean, they featured him, one of the, as far as usage wise, one of the most used players at the position. And he caught 17 of 34 contested catches, 50%, a high amount of volume and a good success rate. He reminds me a lot of Drake London. I think it's going to be inevitable. You are going to see a ton of Drake London comps when people talk about Tet McMillan. He's an exciting player. All right, the third player, also in tier 2. This is my RB1. This is going to be controversial, and I'm ready for the controversy. People are not going to expect this, but Ashton Jeanty out of Boise State is my RB1. I know he doesn't play in a good conference. I hear you, the competition isn't the same as some of the other guys in this class, but he is just built a little bit different. I am very excited to see this guy in the NFL. He is 5'9", 210 pounds. Ashton Jeanty, a former 4-star recruit. He chose to go to Boise State. But we talk about play style. There's actually 3 names that really come to mind when I watch him. Aaron Jones, Alvin Kamara, because of his usage in the air, which we'll talk about, and David Johnson. Somewhere in between there, I think you have an Ashton Jeanty. He put up ridiculous numbers in the air this year. He had more receiving yards than any other running back in college football. That's right, no running back in college football had more receiving yards than him this year. This year, I believe he had almost 500 receiving yards, something absolutely crazy like that. 578, sorry. So 12 away from 600 receiving yards. There'll be receivers that we talk about today who didn't even have as many receiving yards as Ashton Jeanty had last year. How many receiving yards did he have? Well, he had more receiving yards this year than any single season from a Jahmyr Gibbs and a Bijan Robinson. All right. And not only is he good in the air, he's good on the ground. You can see last year, he had over 1,300 rushing yards. He had a 6.2 yards per attempt, 14 rushing touchdowns, and he was the second highest graded PFF runner in the nation. In yards after contact per attempt, he was 3rd in the nation at 4.52. He was the best in the class at that. He forced the most missed tackles of anyone in the class and the most missed tackles per attempt of anyone in this class that I'm kind of comparing to. Okay, so all around a very good player. I understand the competition isn't great, but I am extremely excited about Ashton Jeanty at the next level. All right, my 4th ranked player is another running back. That is Ollie Gordon out of Oklahoma State. He's a younger kid, only 20 years old, former 3-star recruit. When I look at his play, it reminds me a little bit of Arian Foster and Kenyon Drake. I've seen someone mention that. I can kind of see that in the running style, but he's a better prospect than Kenyon Drake obviously will be. Arian Foster was my favorite fit. He had the most rushing yards of anyone in college football last year, over 1,700. He had the 2nd most rushing touchdowns of anyone in college football last year in the coming out of the Big 12 and just across the nation. 21 rushing touchdowns. Only Blake Corum had more, and he's an extremely explosive player. He's a big play waiting to happen. 54.8% of his yards came from breakaway plays, explosive down the field plays. I'm a huge fan of his game. Also, the last player in this tier, which y'all know I'm a big fan of, which we'll talk about, that is Ohio State. Well, recent transfer to Ohio State, Quinshon Judkins. If y'all don't know, most of you would have known by now, but Quinshon Judkins transferred from Ole Miss to Ohio State this offseason, where he will be sharing the backfield with TreVeyon Henderson. Judkins had a little bit of a disappointing sophomore season compared to his freshman season. As a true freshman at Ole Miss, when he shared the backfield with Zach Evans, he had almost 1,600 yards on 5.7 yards per attempt. Super explosive, super dynamic, super efficient. As a sophomore, you can see we actually tracked his numbers as a sophomore. He had a 4.3 yards per attempt, which out of 157 running backs who had at least 100 attempts last year, he was 137th. Well down the chart in efficiency as far as a yards per attempt metric. He also wasn't as good through contact as I would have wanted him to be. He had a 3.21 yards with a contact per attempt number. Not a bad number by any means, but he has a ton of physicality. I mean, you can see the missed tackles that he forced, 78, which was 4th best in the nation. So clearly he's a physical player, but he just wasn't as efficient when he became the unquestioned guy as a sophomore without any Zach Evans to kind of take that workload away from him. So I'm curious to see what he does in a better offense, an offense that is a little bit more balanced, but I do think he is a very good player. All right, we are going to go on to the next tier, and I know this is already going to piss some people off. That's completely fine if you disagree, but at the beginning of my tier 3 is my RB4 and my 6th ranked player in the class. That is TreVeyon Henderson. You all know him by now. We thought he probably would come out in 2024. He decided not to. This is an extremely explosive player. A 44.3% breakaway percentage, which was 36th best in the nation, and he was super efficient with a 5.9 yards per attempt. My issue with TreVeyon is just, I think through contact, he's not as good as I would have wanted him to have been. He only forced 29 missed tackles, which was 92nd in the nation. And if you look at missed tackles forced per attempt, he was one of the worst in that category of any running back I tracked that for the 2025 class. He was the third worst out of 13 running backs that I charted. If you want to see these charts for yourself, it's very simple. All you need to do is become a Mother Flocker member with the promo code LAND. When this video is released, I will have this document on the website, this database on the website for you to see through all the positions. You can see how I charted them. If you are interested in your Devi or whatever, you want to evaluate these players. So a little bit worse through contact than I anticipated, but again, very good through the air, super explosive. Reminds me a little bit of Tiki Barber and D'Angelo Williams. I'm a big fan of his game. The running backs are a huge strength of this class. No one can convince me otherwise after researching a little bit more in depth. All right, let's talk about some wide receivers. We're going to go on a run of 3 guys I really love, and they are my 7A, B, and C. I don't know how to rank these guys. I love all of them equally. 7A, we'll talk about Evan Stewart. Now, Evan Stewart had a very poor season last year at Texas A&M. In fact, he's one of the worst players that I charted. All right, so it might be a little bit unfair, but I am projecting. Evan Stewart, a former 5-star recruit, he just transferred from Texas A&M to Oregon. He had a good freshman year at Texas A&M. The sophomore season was not good. Keep in mind, his starting quarterback, Connor Wegman, did go down with an injury. He only played 4 games, and that entire team collapsed under Jimbo Fisher. I mean, that entire organization just collapsed last year, so it wasn't all on him. A little bit of projecting here, but I believe that Evan Stewart going to Oregon is going to pair really well with Dylan Gabriel and another guy that we're going to talk about. And I think within that offense, Evan Stewart is going to dominate. He's going to remind people how good of a player he is, because when he's on his best, there are shades of a Devonta Smith type of player. All right, 7B, Emeka Egbuka. I won't dive too far into him. You guys probably already know the name, former 5-star recruit. He only played 10 games last year. He had some injuries, and even some of the games he played in, he was also injured in some of those games. So it's a little bit difficult to evaluate his season from last year. But we do know he's a very effective player when healthy. He reminds me a lot of Chris Godwin and Juju Smith-Schuster from a play style perspective. 7C is Tez Johnson. This will be Evan Stewart's teammate at Oregon this year. Tez Johnson had one hell of a year last year with Bo Nix and alongside Troy Franklin. Outside of Luther Burden, Tez had the best charts of all the wide receivers that I charted kind of in this cycle, right? If you look at touchdowns, he's right up there with Tet tied for first in this class that we're looking at. If you look at PFF grade, he had the 10th best in the nation. If you look at reception percentage, he caught over 81% of his targets, 4th best in the nation. If you look at yak, he was even better in yak per reception than Luther was, which means that he was better in yak per receptions than Malik Neighbors, then Marvin Harrison Jr. in this class, then Troy Franklin in this class. And if you look at yards per route run, he has a 3.45. If you guys know anything about yards per route run, the number, anything over 3 is good. 3.45 is ridiculous. Again, a better yards per route run than Luther Burden, a better yards per route run than Malik, then I believe Marvin as well. So he put up some very impressive numbers. He was very efficient and a player that I really enjoy watching. Now, unfortunately, he is a little bit undersized, so that is something that we have to consider. He is 5'10", 160 pounds. But with the modern day game, we're seeing guys like Nico Collins, Tutu Atwell a little bit for when Cooper Kupp was out, Zay Flowers. We're seeing these undersized guys. Jordan Addison really make an impact at the next level. All right, I believe there is one more player in this tier before we go to the next tier, and that is Shedeur Sanders. I know a lot of people are not going to like this. Shedeur is an easy name to hate. A lot of times, he and his dad kind of put it on themselves. You know, they make these bold claims. Sometimes they back it up. When Shedeur pointed to the watch when he beat the 1-5 Arizona State team last year, like, dude, you should have beat that team. So I get it. Like, some of that stuff doesn't sit well with me, but I can tell you guys that this kid can absolutely play. That's just, regardless of what you think about him, the kid can play. He has greens all across his chart. All right, let's look at this chart for Shedeur Sanders. Completion percentage, he was 9th in the nation. All right, and look at interceptions. He threw the 3rd fewest interceptions of any quarterback who had at least 200 dropbacks last year. He had the 8th best PFF passing grade. Big time throw percentage, he was 40th, but at a 5%. And turnover worthy plays, he does not force plays when they're not there. He had a 1.6% turnover worthy play percentage that was 4th best in the nation. He's also really good at the deep ball. He had a 95.3 PFF deep ball passing grade. Those are throws over 20 yards. That was 7th best in the nation. And by the way, take all this into account when you consider that he had the worst offensive line of anyone in college football last year. You can make the argument, okay? He was the 2nd most pressured quarterback in all of college football. In all of college football, he was pressured 194 times. Very rarely, if any games, did Shedeur have a healthy pocket where he could sit in there and dissect the defense. At Colorado, they addressed their offensive line. I think he's going to have an even better year this year. I think Shedeur Sanders has a legit shot of being a 1st-round pick. And you can hate on me if you want for saying it, but it's truly how I feel. All right, let's get into tier 4. It is straight running backs in tier 4. That is the strength of this class. The first running back that we're going to talk about here is Omarion Hampton out of North Carolina. Omarion, sea breeze, if you know, you know. All right, I'm sorry. All right, we'll move on. We'll move on. Omarion Hampton out of North Carolina. He played with Drake May. He was 5th in rushing yards with 1,500. He had 5.9 yards per attempt, great number, 15 rushing touchdowns, had an over 90 PFF receiving grade. He was 11th in yards after contact per attempt. He forced 67 missed tackles. And, just an all-around really, really good player. Put up some huge numbers. He was a good recruit. And I think he'll take another step as he has his 3rd year in North Carolina. My 12th ranked player is a player that I love, but just massively disappointed me when I dived into the analytics. That is running back out of Penn State, Nicholas Singleton. He's a former 5-star recruit. His play style reminds me a ton of Nick Chubb. So I think at his peak, he can be one of the better players at his position in all of college football. But last year, and it wasn't all his fault, he had a genuinely awful year analytically. I know a lot of Penn State fans will point this out, that the offensive coordinator was really bad last year. They just changed their offensive coordinator. But it has to be said that if you look at his charts, they are genuinely awful. Let's look at Nicholas Singleton here. We'll highlight him on the screen for you. Yards per attempt, 4.4. That's 132nd out of 157 running backs. PFF grade, 72.2. 142nd. Yards after contact per attempt, 2.81, which is 124th. Missed tackles forced per attempt. There's only one other running back that I charted that had a worse missed tackles forced per attempt number. That was Donovan Edwards out of Michigan. And we know how poor his year was last year. His breakaway percentage was horrid. Very few explosive plays. So a player that I love, but a player that did not reach his potential last year. You can love him just like I did, but we can also hopefully agree that he was a disappointment. Hopefully he turns it around. Another running back out of Oregon State, Damian Martinez, a really exciting player, but not heavily used in the air. I mean, if we look at his charts here, I'll highlight him. You can see he had the least amount of work in the air of any running back that I charted. Only 11 receptions, despite having 195 rushing attempts. Only 126 receiving yards. Very sparingly used in the air. I would love for him to expand that part of his game, but very efficient player. 6.1 yards per attempt. He had 9 touchdowns, a really good yards after contact per attempt number, missed tackles forced per attempt number. So there's a lot of exciting things there. I think he's a starting caliber running back in the NFL, but he needs to take another step. All right, the last player in this tier. Last year, I put my stamp on Trey Benson as a player that I love this time last year. This year, I'm going to put my stamp on Oregon's Jordan James. Jordan James is going to be a name that we are talking about this time next year. If you're in Devy, get your hands on some Jordan James. It's the same thing I said last year about Trey Benson, okay? He didn't get volume, but he was dominant with the touches that he had. We'll highlight him here on the charts. No one in college football last year had a better PFF rushing grade than Jordan James. Not a single player who had 100 attempts had a better PFF rushing grade. He had over 4 yards after contact per attempt. His missed tackles forced per attempt was second best of any running back that I tracked, only behind Ashton Genty. He had a 37% breakaway percentage. He had 11 touchdowns, and he was the most efficient running back in college football in the 2025 class last year. 7.1 yards per attempt was 4th best in the nation. Of course, he benefited from Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, Tez Johnson, Bucky Irving, but the opportunities that he had, he was super efficient with those opportunities. So I do think he's going to take a huge step this year. Now, something that is a little bit concerning about his profile is that he is a little bit undersized at 205 pounds, but I still think he's going to be a very good player in the NFL, and he can put some pounds on that body. Okay, we are going to try and fly through these next tiers, so I won't go as in depth, but we will quickly talk about all of these players. All right, at 16, the first player in tier 5, Travis Hunter out of Colorado. Look, if I knew that Travis Hunter was going to enter the NFL as a wide receiver, guys, to be honest with you, he's probably right beside Evan Stewart, if not ahead of Evan Stewart in these rankings. But we don't know that. So if I'm going to try and value him for anyone out there in Devy, it's difficult for me to really value a guy who is most likely going to play cornerback. The issue is he's so damn good at wide receiver too. I mean, look at this this chart that we have for Travis Hunter. He had the best drop percentage of anyone in this class. In fact, he didn't drop a single pass. He had the best drop percentage in the nation last year. He didn't drop a single pass on, I believe, over 70 targets. He had the best contested catch percentage. 7 out of 11 contested catches he caught, 63%. And I know a lot of people out there would agree with me. Travis Hunter is different. Like, when the ball is in the air, you're talking about a ball winner, he is a very rare breed. He is coming down with the ball 9 times out of 10. Well, here, 7 times out of 11. But he's a special player. Missed tackles forced per target. He led wide receivers in that number, which is a number that I've kind of created. I'm not seeing someone use it, but I try and find ways where after the catch, just outside of yak, what else could we look at? So missed tackles forced per target. Travis was best amongst the wide receivers I tracked. I love him. I just think he's going to be a cornerback at the end of the day. I think that's what he's going to do. Maybe he does both. All right, let's talk about some quarterbacks. I'm going to list off 3 names: Connor Wegman, Carson Beck, and Quinn Ewers. Connor's out of Texas A&M, former 5-star recruit. Carson Beck is out of Georgia, and Quinn Ewers is out of Texas. If we talk about Connor first, Connor is a former 5-star recruit. He's a very young player. And if we look at him last year, he only played 4 games. So I couldn't really properly track him. What I will say, in those 4 games, he was the best under pressure of any quarterback that I tracked in the 2025 class. He had the 4th best under pressure grade of any quarterback last year. Now, unfortunately, we didn't get to see too much of him, but in his 4 games, he threw 8 touchdowns and only threw 2 interceptions. He had a 2.1% turnover worthy rate, which is a very good number. He's a big body, 6'3", 215. He's got good pedigree. He is one of these guys who could come from the shadows and break out of nowhere and be in the conversations as a first-round pick. Carson Beck, 6'4", 220 pounds. He also charted really, really well. He had the best completion percentage of anyone in this class, 72.2%. He was just under 4,000 yards, 3rd most in the nation. He had a good yards per attempt. And just overall, like a really well-rounded player. I'm not sure he's a superstar because he plays within Georgia. Georgia's a good team all around him. Some of the most talented players in the nation. So you just kind of have to play your part, and he played his part really, really well. We also have Quinn Ewers, which you guys know Quinn Ewers by now, 6'2", 195 pounds. At one point, he was the most well-respected recruit ever at the position. But I've obviously had my concerns from quite some time. All right, into tier 6. This is where the rest of my top 24 lies. At number 18, we have Kaytron Allen, the running back out of Penn State. He shared the backfield with Nicholas Singleton, and he had a decent year. But still, just like Nicholas, a lot of concerns. Firstly, breakaway percentage, only 30.4%. That indicates to us that he doesn't really have that many explosive plays thus far. He also wasn't used much in the air. He had 14 receptions, only 81 receiving yards, the fewest amount of receiving yards in particular of any running back in college football. I think he's a very well-rounded back, but I still have questions around his ability to lead a back at the backfield at the next level. At 19, let's talk about Kansas's Devin Neal. I actually really love Devin Neal. He was one of my favorite sleepers in the 2024 class before he decided to come back to Kansas, but super explosive player, 47% breakaway percentage, had a 0.3 missed tackles forced per attempt, which was the third best of any running back I charted, had a 6.3 yards per attempt number, which was 16th best in the nation, a very good back, lacks true long run speed, like home run hitting long run speed, but you don't necessarily need that to be successful at the next level. He has one of the best bags, if you will, in the class at the running back position. As far as like, all right, put this guy in space and make this guy miss in front of you. Make your man miss ability is Devin Neal's best attribute by far. The dude is ridiculously hard to tackle. All right, at 20, how about a wide receiver, Torrey Horton out of Colorado State? We thought he might declare this year, but he made the right decision by going back to college because this class is not as stacked at wide receiver in 2025. But he had the most receptions of any wide receiver in the 2025 class. He had over 1,100 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, and he caught over 71% of his balls. Big body. We're talking 6'2", 190 pounds, so definitely a guy that could play on the outside if he'd like. But a big fan of his game. We've got a couple quarterbacks as well here, Drew Allar and Dylan Gabriel. Dylan Gabriel just transferred to Oregon. His chart is actually really intriguing. A lot of greens across his chart. 4th best NFL passer rating, 5th best PFF passing grade, threw 30 touchdowns, the most of any quarterback in this class, and had the 8th best completion percentage. My issue is that he's a little undersized. He's a true 5'11" player, so I think he might end up being a better collegiate guy than a real NFL talent. And as far as Drew Allar goes, Drew Allar is one of my favorite wild cards in the entire class. Former 5-star recruit. He's got a ridiculous body at 6'5", 243. I mean, he's got a tight end body, a real tight end body playing the quarterback position. His completion percentage was atrocious, under 60% last year. His yards per attempt was atrocious. His big time throw percentage was atrocious, but everything else looks really promising. In fact, he was the best at interceptions as far as throwing fewer interceptions than anyone else in this class. He only threw 2 interceptions last year, which was best in the nation, compared to 25 passing touchdowns. He also made smart decisions. He was the best at turnover-worthy play percentage. 1.1% of his plays were turnover-worthy. That is the 2nd best in the nation. So big body, super good athlete. There's a huge wild card to his profile there. And the last 2 names that we'll talk about are 2 tight ends. Colston Loveland out of Michigan. Colston Loveland is 6'5", 245. Super dynamic player in Michigan's offense. Already almost 700 receiving yards last year, and he's about to be a feature of this offense. That dude is an absolute unit. I love his game. And then Luke Lachey out of Iowa, injured in 2023, wants to come back and prove himself. But man, Iowa just consistently pops off those really good tight ends in the NFL. So, all right, gang. So I'm sitting here editing this video, and I realized that I didn't even talk about any of my honorable mentions, but in case you care at all, Jackson Dart's the quarterback out of Ole Miss. Jalen Milroe, you guys know, out of Alabama. Cameron Ward is the kid who transferred to Miami. Antoine Juice Wells is joining Jackson Dart at Ole Miss. Big body. I really think he could have a breakout year if he can stay healthy. Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden are both wide receivers that are very interesting that transferred to Texas. So they'll be playing with Quinn Ewers as Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy move on. Y'all know Donovan Edwards and Raheem Sanders. KJ Jefferson out of UCF. Oscar Delp is the tight end that is replacing Brock Bowers at Georgia. So those are just some of the names that I thought I should put on the radar because I really do think Dart, Milroe, and Ward all have a chance to like break out. I would say Jackson Dart of any of these names as my honorable mentions is the one that I'm the most excited about. Younger player, has some serious potential. We'll see if he can put it all together this year. But that's it. I appreciate y'all. Thanks for watching. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.